Humanity is broadly moving in the right direction, but a wide gap persists between what the data show and what the public believes. And the good news of human progress rarely makes the nightly news. A new website aims to help correct those persistent myths regarding the state of humanity, presenting empirical data that focuses on long-term developments. Marian Tupy is the editor of humanprogress.org. He joins us to discuss his work and answer your questions next. Welcome and thank you for joining us here in the Walter and Elizabeth Hagens Multimedia Center here at the Cato Institute. My name is Caleb Brown. I'm the Director of Multimedia here at Cato. Today I'm talking with Marian Tupy. He is the editor of Cato's new website, humanprogress.org. He's also a policy analyst at the Cato Institute's Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. Marian, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Caleb. Thank you for having me, and thanks to all the donors for your support. It wouldn't be possible without you guys.
So if you would like to join us here as we begin this conversation, please enter your questions into the chat room and we'll get to them as quickly as possible. But I'm going to begin our conversation here. The Pope, Pope Francis, is Time's Man of the Year, and recently he wrote a piece in which his thesis was essentially taking issue with what he called unbridled capitalism. He argues that capitalism has enriched a few, but has largely failed the poor. He draws particular point to inequality. He draws attention as well to what he talks about violence that is rampant, as he describes it. Now, you took to the pages of The Atlantic recently and took issue, broadly speaking, with what the Pope had to say. What are your issues with what the Pope said, and why is the story a little better than the one that he's telling?
Well, first of all, I think I need to say that I actually like this Pope a lot. He's a very humble man. He obviously cares a lot about the world's poor and unfortunate, and he speaks from a heart that is really big, and that is truly wonderful. But his apostolic exhortation, which I took a specific issue with, made a number of assertions which, in my view, were not based in reality. The Pope didn't simply say that the world is an imperfect place. We all know it's an imperfect place. We all know that there are women abused in India and other places. We all know there is poverty in Africa, child labor, civil wars, and so on. The Pope actually said that things were getting worse. He asserted that there is greater global inequality. He asserted there is greater violence. And he asserted that poverty is worsening. Now, we have data to show that that is actually not the case. Not data produced by the Cato Institute. Feel free to ignore that. What we're talking about is data produced by international organizations such as the World Bank, the IMF, the Eurostat, the OECD, and also by a variety of independent academics who have been studying this and who have shown that, in fact, global inequality is on the decline, in large part because China, 1.6 billion people, is growing richer. Violence is at a low point, and also poverty has been declining at the fastest rate, according to the Brookings Institution, in human history. So I took the issue with that, and I published the article, and I'm happy to say it was shared by 6,000 people on Facebook, heavily commented on, and that's what we are in the business of doing.
And it's amazing, surprising to me, and once again, please, if you've got any questions, please drop them into the chat room, and I'll do my best to get to as many of those questions as possible. It's amazing to me, continues to be amazing to me, how few people are aware of the good news about humanity's progress over the last 5-6 decades.
Well, really, for millennia, humanity was nothing very much changed in human affairs. Whether you were born in year 1 or in year 1000, your living standard hasn't changed all that much. But it was really with the arrival of industrialization, mechanization, and globalization in the 19th century that we see tremendous increases in growth rates, incomes, declines in contagious diseases, and so on. But you raise a very important point. Why is it that we are so ready to believe bad news? And I think that there are at least, not exhaustive list, but at least two very important reasons. One is that anthropologists believe that we have evolved to prioritize bad news. It was the pessimists who survived, people who were always on the lookout for bad things happening. And it was the optimists who got robbed, cheated, killed, or eaten by lions, what have you. So biologically, we may be predisposed to react to bad news much more so than good news. But also there is ideology, which is to say that a lot of people have been taught from early age that the world is an awful place and that capitalism is the primary force responsible for making the world a worse place. And so people who are biased against free markets and capitalism can do one of two things. They can either ignore the good news, or they have to change their premises. They have to change their basic outlook on life. And a lot of people choose to ignore the good news so that they can keep on hating capitalism, which is what they believe is the right thing to do because they've been taught to do that from an early age and they see it on TV every day.
All right, well, let's talk about something else. Nelson Mandela, who recently passed away and is, as we broadcast this, is lying in state. He changed dramatically in his views on markets and their ability to solve problems.
Well, it's a funny thing and very little known thing that actually the greatest amount of liberalization, economic liberalization in South Africa happened under Mandela, in large chunk because he deregulated the agricultural sector, which was heavily regulated. One of the least well-known stories about South Africa is that actually it was a heavily regulated economy under the regime of apartheid. It was basically it was crony capitalism, but it was also state-led economic development. Agriculture was heavily regulated. The communication sector and the industry were dominated by very large parastatals or state-owned companies. And when Mandela came in, bear in mind, this followed the collapse of socialism throughout the world. So, a lot of people in South Africa were ready for a bout of liberalization. After he left the political scene in 1995, I think, his successors stopped the process of liberalization and have started to re-regulate the economy, which has in fact become less free over the last decade.
All right. We're going to go into a little bit of the data that people can find at humanprogress.org. The first one here is something that you draw attention to, work fatalities and economic freedom. You compare those two things, or at least place them in juxtaposition on the same chart. Why is that a relevant thing to do?
Well, first thing I should probably mention is that the charts that the donors see come from the actual website, our website, humanprogress.org, and this particular website, this particular chart is created by combining two different variables of human well-being. One is economic freedom and the other one is work fatalities. Now, in the popular mind, when people think about economic liberalization and economic freedom, they think that once you deregulate the economy, that means it's free for all, wild, wild west. Workers start dying on the job. There is no work safety and what have you. In fact, what we see is over the past 30 to 40 years is globally an increase in economic freedom and a rapid decline in work fatalities. And you would expect that to happen because as countries grow richer, as companies earn more money, people start demanding, well, as countries grow richer, people start demanding higher salaries and better work protection. In my view, work safety is a result of economic development, not a prerequisite for economic development.
Now, one sponsor asks, we see the benefits of economic freedom in several Asian countries, but there is still a reluctance to tolerate challenges to the ruling party, for example, Singapore. Is this a contradiction, a paradox?
Well, I think that when you look, obviously we are working on the assumption that as economic freedom advances and as people become richer, they will also start demanding more political rights. That is the basis for encouraging capitalism in the People's Republic of China, for example. And I think that I have no doubt that even the Chinese regime, as horrible as it is much more responsive to the complaints of the people than it was 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. When it comes to Singapore, I'm not a specialist on this particular country. I would imagine that in time, as people become richer, as they have more access to information, they will start demanding more political rights. Singapore, after all, was in a very similar situation as Hong Kong, and Hong Kong now has much more democracy than it used to. Hopefully Singapore will too.
All right. One of the other charts that you can dig up for yourself at humanprogress.org, life expectancy at birth. You pointed to industrialization as a major contributing factor to the human development, and it's pretty clear from this chart here. What do we know about life expectancy over the last 200 or 300 years?
Oh, we can go much further back in time. Essentially, longevity, or rather life expectancy, I should say, has not moved for millennia. Again, whether you lived 10,000 years ago, at the beginning of the agricultural revolution, or whether you lived in 1000 AD, you could expect to live to about 30 years. And that was the case until really the 1800s. And what happens in the 1800s is that suddenly you see this hockey stick effect, where for a long time there is no change, and suddenly you see this spike in longevity as people are growing older. Now that was based in part because we began to understand much better what were the reasons for the most common and the most devastating diseases, such as, for example, cholera. There was a revolution in understanding the germ theory of disease, and smart people like Pasteur and Koch and others were able to identify the way that germs traveled through air or through water, and we were for the first time ever able to take precautions. Now, it is very true that during those days, cities and communes had a large role to play in improving healthcare throughout, especially Western Europe, by building canalization and access to clean water. But the reason why all this progress was possible in Western Europe especially was because the societies became richer. Suddenly, municipalities and towns and entire countries were awash with money, which they never had before, and they could invest it in canalization and so on. And that is a direct result of industrialization and globalization, the abundance of wealth.
Now, we talk about this a lot, and there are a lot of well-meaning people who want to take many of the, what you would say are the results of massive wealth creation, and impose those types of systems, worker protections, removing certain employment opportunities from people in very, very poor countries. And you would, I guess, argue that they're putting the cart before the horse.
Yes, I mean, let's not kid ourselves. America in 1900 or 1850, for an ordinary person, wasn't a paradise. People worked very long hours. They saw their children die at a very young age. Often people went hungry, cold, and so on. But that was the case throughout human history. I think that what people in India and China, Bangladesh and Vietnam and all of these up-and-coming countries are experiencing is something that we had to go through in order to develop. And during that period of development, it's not an easy thing to do. But you have to go through it in order to become prosperous. And I think they are well on their way. And what you don't want to do is to burden businesses and firms with too onerous expectations in terms of health and safety regulations and so on, which sound very good in theory, but can actually result in dampening economic growth. And the one thing that you don't want to do in developing countries is to slow their rate of growth. Growth is the sine qua non. Without growth, you don't have better healthcare, better education, better equality for women, etc.
Sam, a sponsor, asks a question. What are the important and some of the not so important, maybe even silly measures of human progress? Is there general agreement across the political spectrum of what constitutes progress?
Well, thank you, Sam. Good question. Some of these measurements of human well-being are accepted universally. Infant mortality is one of them. Obviously, nothing worse for parents than to see their child die. Education attainment, enrollment of girls, especially in school. Today, some 80% of Afghani girls go to primary school and will be able to read and write and hopefully assert their rights as a result of access to better information and understanding that understanding of the rights and privileges that girls in the West enjoy. Other things are longevity, obviously, income per capita, and these, I would say, are the core of what well-being is constituted of. What are the silly ones? Well, recently, for example, there has been a release of a study on gender equality. And gender equality, we all agree, is very important, except that in this particular case, this particular study based its evaluations on quotas and laws that have been passed on Parliament to, for example, artificially increase number of women in parliaments. So you end up in a position where, for example, the United States comes below Cuba. Well, would you as a woman want to be in the United States, or would you want to be in Cuba? So I think the answer is obvious. And so we also have to beware of some statistics out there or measurements of well-being which are not really which do not really reflect human well-being, but may reflect some kind of legislation that is not pertinent to the state of the world.
All right, we have another sponsor question. The question is, should the U.S. keep giving aid to corrupt countries, and is there an alternative?
Well, right now, obviously, any aid that we give to anybody, we first have to borrow. We are running a large deficit. It's not like America is awash with money, which we can then send to poor countries. There's a plethora of literature, hundreds of reasons why we shouldn't be giving money to developing countries. It's not just corruption, which is bad enough. The fact that American taxpayers' money very seldom reaches the people for whom it is intended. The most important reason why aid is a bad idea is because it discourages reforms in the developing world. When you have a government that has two options, we can either deregulate the economy, create economic growth, and get taxes from the people, or we can rely on help from the United States or Netherlands or Sweden. Well, of course, people governments will get the donor money first, and that discourages both political and economic reform. And that is part of the reason why countries in Africa remain both poor, but also least economically and politically free.
All right, we're going to go back to some of the data that you can find at humanprogress.org. A lot of people point to the labor force participation rate and its general decline over time, sort of as a negative thing. In particular, that it's used as sort of a club against this president. Whenever new unemployment data comes out, the labor force participation rate is always what people point to criticize this president. But when you point to hours worked, you see that decline as a good thing. Why is that?
Well, there's a difference between the two statistics, obviously. The first statistic reflects the number of people who may be discouraged from looking for a job because it either pays for them to be on welfare or they have simply given up. And that is not good for them, and it's not good for the economy, because every time you withdraw a person from the labor market, obviously the economy grows less. Now, in terms of hours worked per person, and we also have statistics on hours worked per worker, those have been declining. And that's whilst at the same time, compensation per worker has been increasing, which indicates that really the productivity gains that we have experienced since 1950, which is when I think that particular statistic starts, have been truly great. Holland is a country which is a well-developed and rich country. They do not prevent people from working extra hours, but we've seen a massive decline in amounts of hours that individual workers put in, something from, I think, from about 1,900 a year to 1,400 a year or so. I can't quite remember the statistics, but the point is numbers of hours worked have been declining throughout developed countries. As countries become richer, people can afford to work less. It's an interesting thing. In ancient Rome, for example, they didn't have a concept of a weekend. People just went working throughout the year, and sometimes there were public holidays, which is what the people really were looking forward to and enjoyed. And then more recently, we got a 1 day off. Sunday used to be the day off, and now 2-day weekend is completely de rigueur, as it were, even though it is a relatively new phenomenon.
All right. Another sponsor has a question here. Rick asks, what can the average citizen do to change the narrative and make it known that we are progressing and that economic freedom is a main factor of that progress?
Well, thank you, Rick, and please use
I'm sorry, that was Rich.
That was Rich. So, Rich, thank you very much, and please use humanprogress.org. And I'm not being facetious. The reason why we have created this website is precisely for people like you. You sit around the dining room table, or you're having an involved conversation with friends who are misguided, and they will say something like, oh my goodness, isn't it horrible that airline tickets are going through the roof and it's going to cost me $100 more than last year to visit my family in Florida. And then you can go to our website and find out that it actually over time from the 1970s, adjusted for inflation, airline tickets have declined in price. Or you can see prices of food, meat, poultry, beef, what have you, and see that in fact, adjusted for inflation, these price hikes had not been huge, especially when you consider how much more money we make on average. But so humanprogress.org is supposed to be another arrow in your quiver, so to speak, so that you can show human progress. Now, as I said, there are a number of reasons why people are pessimistic about human development. Part of it is probably evolutionary. Part of it has to do with the fact that media, the education system, are just anti-capitalist. I cannot explain why they are anti-capitalist, but they are. And so people are fed anti-capitalist propaganda every day. And really, the best thing that we have on our side are the facts. And these are not the facts from the Cato Institute or the Heritage Foundation. These are facts coming from the World Bank and the IMF. These are facts coming from individual academics in tenured academic professions. And you can say, look, third-party researchers are showing that violence, for example, is declining, and that is the sort of thing that hopefully will make your interlocutors think a little more about what they're saying.
So we have a little bit of time left. If you'd like to jump in and ask a question, please go ahead and do so. Our sponsor, Dan, asks, does the Millennium Challenge program succeed in encouraging policy reform in countries receiving those funds?
The Millennium Challenge program, my colleague Ian Vasquez has written a wonderful paper about the Millennium Challenge program. Part of the reason why we have been critical of the Millennium Challenge program in the past is because it didn't get rid of the USAID. It was an additional aid program on top of USAID, on top of all the other bilateral and multilateral aid agencies. So even if the Millennium Challenge Corporation, as it is called, was doing everything right, you still have the problems and the disincentives created by the other aid agencies in America and abroad. The other problem that Ian pointed to, and it came true, was that the rules under which money will be given to developing countries under the Millennium Challenge Program can be changed. And in fact, we have already seen under State Secretary Clinton that there was a push to include environmental and labor standards into lending money to Africa, for example, rather than relying on economic freedom and other requirements which have been put into place originally. So overall, it's probably not terribly helpful.
All right. We're going to look at a little bit more data from humanprogress.org. What conclusions can we draw about the experiences of Chile and Venezuela with respect to income and GDP?
So I don't quite remember all the numbers. However, what I do know is that Venezuela was, for the longest time, the richest country in Latin America. And back in the early 1970s, its GDP per capita was a multiple of that in Chile. Now, Chile opted for an economic freedom model. Beginning in the late 1970s, they started to deregulate the economy and embraced free market capitalism, whilst Venezuela obviously went the other way. It didn't deregulate much before Chavez, and after Chavez, it became a quasi-socialist country. And what we saw was absolutely beautiful. We see in that graph that Chile today is actually much richer. Well, it's actually richer than Venezuela. So Chile has done a tremendous catch-up with Venezuela, and that is primarily due to the economic policies.
All right. One sponsor asks, what theory governs our understanding of a sweet spot between purely unregulated free markets versus so-called mixed economy?
I don't really know. I think that we like to point to Hong Kong and Singapore as the least regulated economies, and we want as many countries to resemble that model as possible. One of the important things about Economic Freedom Index that I'm referring to is that if you look at growth rates and economic freedom quintiles, you see that most economically free countries grow at the fastest pace. So we would expect African countries, for example, if they move toward the top half or the top third of the Economic Freedom Index, that they would grow at a much faster pace than they do currently.
And we've seen that.
And we've seen that with some of them, especially Botswana, which is a huge success story, closely followed by Rwanda. So to answer your question, we have examples of how to do things right. Those countries are in the top 10 or 20 of the Economic Freedom Index, and we take our cues from those top performers.
All right. Another question from a sponsor. Why do you think people always seem to focus on inequality rather than worrying about absolute increases in wealth and well-being?
That's a fascinating question. In many ways, the concern about inequality, this is just my personal view, is in itself a sign of human progress. For millennia of our evolution, of our being on this earth as a species, what we have worried about is personal survivor and the survivor of our immediate families. And it wasn't clear at all whether today there would be enough food and enough firewood for us to wake up alive tomorrow morning. So for the longest time, our biggest concern was about the people immediately around us. Today, not only do we care about inequality within our own societies, such as the United States, and being concerned about the rising inequality there, but we are concerned about inequality between the United States and India and China and people of whom we know next to nothing. And so in some ways you could see the concern about inequality as a sign of human progress.
That it is the concern itself is a sign of human progress. We're going to go to one more piece of data that you can find at humanprogress.org, which is GDP per capita over recent decades. How effective is GDP per capita specifically at capturing the changes in wealth in a country?
It's like the Churchill quote about democracy. It's that it's a terrible system except for all the others. Look, there are a lot of people who quibble about whether GDP really captures the essence of human well-being, which is why you have crazy leaders like the leader of Bhutan, I believe, who refuses to collect GDP stats and instead focuses on the happiness index or something like that. But I'm not from that school of thought. I do think that GDP, as a general rule, GDP per capita, adjusted for purchasing power parity, does reflect the level of human well-being. In part because the richer you are, the more you can, so to speak, buy of other things that form human well-being: leisure, education for your children, food, better healthcare, and so on. I think it was Paul Collier of Oxford University, a very well-known, in fact, probably the best-known economic development specialist in the world today, who said, growth is not everything, but without growth, very little is possible, or something to that effect. So, I can see why people think, maybe we should move beyond growth, not just talk about growth, but really growth is the sine qua non of human progress. The richer we are, the more we can purchase. That doesn't prevent people from making mistakes with their money, but that is a separate conversation.
All right, this is going to be our last question. This is from Chris. Germany and Scandinavian countries are often used as examples of how regulation can promote economic equality. Is that a myth?
To some extent, yes, it is. I think that, let's not forget, Sweden is an excellent example of what Chris is asking about. Sweden has grown tremendously in the 19th century and all the way up to 1960. It experienced very high growth rates. And what was once a primarily agricultural society became an advanced nation by 1960. But if you look at the amount of money that the government was spending, the percentage of GDP spent by the Swedish government up to 1960, it was actually on the low end. It was fully comparable to the United States and Britain and so on. Then in the 1960s, the Swedish people, in their infinite wisdom, started electing social democratic governments, which jacked up the government spending, and also started regulating the economy much more heavily. 1990, Greek-style collapse of the Swedish economy. You have a massive crisis. And after that, the Swedes actually begin to liberalize. Today, Sweden in many ways is an example in terms of fiscal rectitude. This is a country which is which I believe is running budget surpluses. This is a country which has given the Swedish parents the opportunity to take their children to any school they want, including for-profit private schools. So Sweden is in no way the sort of socialist paradise which people talk about, or rather which is still stuck in people's minds going back to the 1970s and 1980s.
All right, Marian, thank you very much. That is all the time we have. The website, once again, is humanprogress.org. You can access this and other e-briefings at our website, cato.org, where I assume you're watching this. And of course, we also want to thank you for your generous support. As Cato supporters, you make our work possible, promoting the values of free markets, limited government, individual liberty, and peace. We'll talk to you again next time.